Hello everyone, Dr. Mad here. Let's get mad about poetry. So in this video we are going to look at Kamikaze 2013 by Beatrice Garland. This is a poem about a kamikaze pilot who decides not to go ahead with his mission and the resulting guilt and shame on him and his family. The poem was inspired by the events of 9/11, the plane attacks on the World Trade Center in September 2001. So there's Beatrice Garland. So the word kamikaze has a number of meanings. Nowadays, we just tend to think of it as suicide bomber. It actually refers to the aircraft, and actually, literally, it means divine wind or heavenly wind. So Garland was born in 1938 in Oxford, England, and she's still going strong. She works for the NHS as a clinician and teacher, so she's quite different compared to most of the other poets in the anthology. She was always interested in poetry, and she kind of does that on the side. And she's the only poet to have put up their own biography on the internet, in which she says, "Poetry is a way of talking about how each of us sees, is touched by, grasps, and responds to our own different worlds and the people in them." So there you can see that why she would choose to write a poem like Kamikaze, even though she has no connection to it, no connection to Japan or anything like that. And she's quite inspiring in many ways, actually, that in that she learnt from creative writing classes. So she was always interested in poetry, and she went to these classes to improve her skill. And obviously, it clearly worked. And one lesson she learnt in the classes was that obscurity is not necessarily profundity. So obscure means confusing, and but here she's talking about somebody being deliberately confusing. A writer maybe being deliberately confusing in order to impress. And profound means to be wise. So she's saying just because something is confusing doesn't mean it's wise, which again maybe explains why her writing her poetry, the words themselves are not that difficult. I mean, the poems are complex and profound in that sense, but the language she uses, and quite often she just uses simple adjectives and nouns and so on. So I think her poetry does really match what she's saying about this phrase here. Okay, so as always, here is a glossary for the poem. Please try to learn these words, or at least read through them 2 or 3 times. So when you come to the poem, you can really focus on the meaning of it. And here you can see all the techniques. So as you can see, she uses a lot of techniques, but also including very simple techniques like that. So here are these kamikaze pilots back in the day, and this is a samurai warrior. So you can obviously see here lots of connections to culture and honor and war and identity and duty. Okay, so let's listen to the audio version, and we're lucky that we've got the poet herself reading the poem, and then we'll go through it.
Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the little fishing boats strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea, and beneath them, arcing in swathes like a huge flag, waved first one way then the other in a figure of 8, the dark shoals of fishes flashing silver as their bellies swiveled towards the sun, and remembered how he and his brothers, waiting on the shore, built cairns of pearl-grey pebbles to see whose withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bringing their father's boat safe, yes, grandfather's boat, safe to the shore, salt-sodden, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes. And the neighbours too, they treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chattered and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die.
Okay, so let's go back and go through the poem. So we'll just make sure that we understand what's going on, and then we'll go deeper in the second reading. So it starts off in the third person. So basically the poem is from the point of view of the daughter. Okay, so her father left, and Bart means to leave, at sunrise. Now, that word sunrise is quite interesting actually, because on the one hand, it's literal. He would have left first thing in the morning. Most missions, in war, normally do start in the morning. But there are connotations here of Japan and identity, because Japan is known as the land of the rising sun, and its flag is also basically white background, the sky, with like a red circle representing the sun. And then here you have a list of the things that he takes with him. So water, a samurai sword. So you can see here connotations of war and honor and tradition and culture. A shaven head, obviously, he doesn't take that with him as such. I mean, it's his own head which is shaven. And inside his head are these chants. So again, connotations of religion and culture, and fuel. And it's just one way because he's not planning to come back. Yeah, or he's not supposed to come back. So all of these things have, or these things here have connotations of religion and so on, except for the water. And you might think, well, why does he need water if he's not coming back? If he's a bit thirsty, it doesn't really matter, does it? But although actually also the water can also be used for religious purification and so on. So maybe it was for that or both purposes. But then she says that when he got halfway, and remember, if he goes more than halfway, he can't come back because he's only got enough fuel for a one-way journey. So halfway there, she thinks, recounting, telling the story to her children later on. He, the father, the pilot, the Kamikaze, must have looked down and seen these fishing boats, okay, and the sea. So remember that Japan is an island surrounded by the sea. It's a small island, and water and nature and fishing and boats and so on are a big, big part of the culture. So you would see these boats and this lovely green blue translucent sea. So this means semi-transparent. Here we have a simile. So bunting are those bits of paper that you throw down to celebrate, or colored bits of paper that you string out for a party or something. And then beneath them, meaning beneath the boats, arcing means making a curved shape. Swathes, large strips or areas, like a huge flag. So another simile, and a figure of eight. So she's talking about these fish, and they're swimming around, having fun, swimming around in figures of eight. Shows groups of fish, large groups of fish, and flashing silver. I mean, obviously, there's the different colored fish, but in this case, silver, as their bellies turn, swivel towards the sun and reflect off the sun. And the father must have thought how he used to play with his brothers on the shore, making cairns. So cairns are these piles of stone to see who could build the strongest cairn, strongest pile of stones, so that when these waves, these breakers, so breakers means big waves that come crashing up, making foam. So who could make the strongest pile that wouldn't fall over? This means rush. Sorry, this means rough and rush of the waves, bringing their father's boat back. So here, so notice lots of strong enjambment going on. And italics is where there's indirect speech, the daughter's speech to the children. So she says, yes, grandfather's boat. So that's her grandfather. For the children, it's actually the great grandfather. And notice here that they're waiting for their father to come back safe. So they wanted him to come back safe. So it's ironic, isn't it, that his own children and grandchildren or his wife and so on don't want him to come back safe. So to the shore, and this just means soaked in salt. Cloud marked, that phrase doesn't really mean anything. Maybe it just means white. So this is a type of fish. And obviously these are all sea creatures, crabs and prawns. This is another type of fish. And yet another one. And this is interesting. These words, muscular and dangerous, have connotations of war, don't they? And obviously this is a poem about war. And then here we have italics again. So italics means this kind of writing. You can see that's different to this one. And she says that although he came back, the mother, the wife of the pilot, never spoke in his presence again. She didn't look him in the eye. The neighbors also basically treated him as though he no longer existed, as though he was like a ghost. Only the children still talked and laughed, but then they also became silent to live as though he had never returned. And obviously, this is a metaphor. It's physically still the same father, but maybe it means that either he's changed in his personality and character, or they've changed. Obviously, they've changed in how they look at him. And then here, so notice, by the way, that the first 5 stanzas is all one long sentence representing the plane journey, the non-stop plane journey. And then we have this dialogue, or the daughter speaking is the next sentence. And then we have this final short sentence. And she's saying he must have wondered that would it have been better to die physically on the mission or to die metaphorically, like now that he's like a ghost, nobody talks to him. And if nobody talks to you, that can be quite painful actually, and lonely. Okay, so quite a complex poem in its form and structure, although the actual words are not that difficult. All right, so AO1, to be able to read, understand, and respond to the poem using quotes and references. So here are some possible quotes. Loads there to choose from. You only need about 4 as a minimum, between 4 and 6. Here are all the techniques. I haven't put enchantment in there because obviously that's difficult to put in that sense, to give examples. Please pause the video here and just check that you understand these techniques. Okay, so AO2, language, form and structure, using techniques and terminology. So language means words and phrases. This means thoughts, feelings, images. This means alternative meanings of a word. So for example, we talked about the connotations of sunrise in this particular poem. In terms of form and structure, the poem is not of a specific form, nor does it have a rhyme or rhythm scheme. It is composed of 7 stanzas of 6 lines each, and in that sense, there is some order to the poem. Now remember, if you just say this kind of thing, you don't really get any marks for it. You do need to make some kind of a comment. And luckily, we have the poet to explain this poem to us. Obviously, that's not the case for the old poems. And it's really interesting because sometimes students or anybody really, we read poems and we try to work out why a poem has a certain number of stanzas or lines. And she says there was no real reason for it. It just felt right. It just felt right to have 7 stanzas, and it just felt right to have for each stanza to have 6 lines. Okay, so that's very, very interesting and useful to hear that from the poet herself. So that's something you can refer to that as part of your context. The poet, I mean. All right, so the first 5 stanzas are one long sentence, so that obviously represents the plane journey. The next 2 stanzas are also almost one long sentence, although actually the last 2 lines are a separate sentence. So obviously you've got the dialogue, the speech, and then the final sentence. And in terms of techniques and terminology, Garland uses many techniques, but in particular, her use of simple word classes, nouns and adjectives is really, really powerful, really effective. And those words also happen to be a semantic field of the sea. They are to do with fish and describing the sea and so on. And then some good points to make here that we saw earlier, the fact that the poem was inspired by the events of 9/11. And notice, so that was 2001, but the poem was published in 2013. So it took her 12 years to kind of think about the poem and for it to take shape in her mind. And her comments about the purpose of poetry, which we talked about earlier, I think that's really interesting that you could mention. And also this, we talked about this, that you don't have to be confusing to be wise. Okay, so you have now learned more than enough to get a grade 4 or 5, depending on how you write your essay. Here is a quiz to test your understanding so far. So please pause the video here and answer these questions. If you really struggle, then you need to go back and listen again. I'm going to move on to the answer slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Here are the answers. And if you weren't close, if you've got anything less than 50%, you really need to go back. You're aiming for at least 50%, but then 70, 90, 100%. And the good news is that once you've mastered these questions, all you have to do is to add a bit more detail and convert them into flowing sentences and paragraphs. So you might get a question like this. How does the poet present the theme of honor in Kamikaze? Compare with one other poem in the anthology. So we're not going to do that, but you could compare with these poems here. Now, Kamikaze is really interesting. You can compare it with so many poems, okay? In the introduction video, I put it in the group of effects of conflict with Poppies, Remains, and War Photographer. But actually, so I think Puppies is a really good comparison because in Puppies it's about the effect of on the mother of the son going out to war and actually carrying out his duty and dying and not returning, and the effect on the mother. Here is kind of like the opposite, isn't it? So that's a really interesting comparison to make. Or Charge of the Light Brigade is a really good comparison. There, again, they do carry out their orders, they do go according to the honor code. And even though they know, and in a way, that was a kind of a suicide mission because they knew they were going to there was a high chance they were going to get killed. So that's a really interesting comparison. Or if you want to go down the power of nature route, you could compare with the prelude, which again is quite a strange comparison there because it's about this boat going out and then coming back, isn't it? So there's all kinds of things you can play with there. And you might start with something like this. The poet presents the theme of honor by describing how a kamikaze pilot returns from a mission having decided not to continue and the resulting guilt and shame on him and his family. The poet uses techniques such as listing in order to do this. The poem begins by listing the items that the pilot takes with him: water, samurai sword, shaven head full of incantations. And apart from the water, all of these things have strong connotations of religion, culture, and identity. And actually, as I mentioned earlier, the water could have religious connotations. Quite often, people wash themselves before some kind of a religious event. So about 4 paragraphs like that, plus an introduction and conclusion and a little bit of context would be more than enough to get a grade 4 or 5. But if you're aiming higher, we can carry on. So let's look at the poem again. So in terms of tone and mood, it's quite an analytical tone, and the mood created is kind of like the result of that is quite thoughtful and philosophical. From a reader's point of view, it will depend on the reader really in terms of how they view the pilot's actions, because it's a bit like your attitude to war. Some people are just totally against war, some people love war. Most people are in between, that we kind of accept that sometimes war might be necessary only if you can't think of any other way. And then there is no rhyme or rhythm if you look at the poem, if you go through it. And maybe that's reflecting the fact that, on the one hand, Japan is a very ordered society. You're supposed to kind of do what you're told and respect everybody. But he doesn't do that, the pilot. So maybe the lack of rhyme and rhythm is to reflect his choice of not following the usual methods of behavior. Okay. And then in terms of language, as I say, the actual language is not that difficult. The complexity of the poem is in the overall kind of form and structure, the lack of rhyme and rhythm, the enjambment, the semantic field of the sea, of the adjectives used, simple adjectives used, but in a very powerful way. Okay, so if you're aiming higher, you're going to have to look at the poem from a higher level point of view. There are no real juicy words or phrases that you can really analyze in detail. Although, you can look at things like sunrise and talk about their connotations. And then in terms of context, so you could talk about 9/11, Pearl Harbor. So that's Pearl Harbor is a place in America. That was the area that these kamikaze pilots were attacking during World War II. Don't need to go too much into that, okay? It's English, not history. Just a few sentences would be more than enough to impress the examiner. And so, yeah, you could talk about the strong enjambment and the use of italics for the indirect speech, the 6 stanzas. And then it's interesting that here she chose not to maybe put this into a separate stanza. She could have done that, but then it would have broken up the 6 lines each structure. Okay, so pause the video here and see if you can answer some of these more advanced questions. So remember here, it's not so much about exact answers, it's just getting you to think for yourselves and write some things down. I'm going to move to the answer slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. So there you go. If you were way off, please go back and listen again. But remember here, it's not about exact answers. And if there are here things that you can learn from now, you can do that. So moving on. So you have now learned more than enough for a grade 6 or 7. Such a paragraph might look like this. So up to here is the same as before. And then I've added this bit. There is nothing in the poet's biography to explain why she might be interested in writing about a kamikaze pilot, except that she uses her poetry to explore different worlds and different people, and also has a great interest in the natural world, which explains the natural imagery she uses in the poem. I mean, I should just say, and you could write this down, it's not that she's just made up this natural imagery. I mean, Japan is a beautiful country it's an island surrounded by the beautiful sea. So it's got all this fish and lovely plant life. Okay, so she didn't just make this up; she chose that. But maybe that's why she was drawn to that. Okay, and she has also stated that the poem was inspired by the events of 9/11 and her desire to understand those events. So for grade 8, 9, like I said, it's not so much about individual words and phrases. They're quite straightforward, although you can go into the connotations of things that can get you to the highest grades. But if you're aiming for the highest grades, I think you're going to have to look at it from a higher level point of view. As I mentioned earlier, the semantic field of the sea, the use of enjambment and sentence structure, those 3 sentences, one long sentence about the plane journey, then the long sentence with the speech, and then the final short sentence. The references to identity and culture and honor and tradition and war and all that. And you could look at also at the connection to 9/11, Pearl Harbor, and the use of suicide missions throughout history. But remember, this is English, not history. You don't have to go too much into that. I mean, as a grade 8, 9 student, you'll be the sort of student who likes to read up on things just out of interest. But in terms of your essay, you just need a few sentences, okay? Most of your writing, your essay should focus on the poem itself, on the language, form, and structure. And once you've got your head around all that, you can complete the essay we've started. How does the poet present the theme of honor in Kamikaze? So it's a really interesting poem to write about, actually. And that's it. Hopefully you found that video useful. And if so, please do subscribe and tell all your friends about it. And I will see you in the next video for the next poem.